So all of our services are provided like that. Now, we as an organisation don't just provide services, we also do lobbying, mainly on behalf of the women that we see. So I think it's one of those things around the world, it's not just a Gibraltar thing, that women don't always feel able to talk about their abortions. So I think some of that's changing a little bit. We're seeing a lot more people willing to come out and talk, but realistically for a long time, if anyone from the press called and said, oh, can you give me a case study, it would be next to impossible because women just didn't want to talk about what they'd experienced. And I think part of that is stigma. I think part of it is that they may not have told the people closest to them, that they may have worried that they'd be identified. And for a lot of women as well, I think that they either worry about having to have that conversation with someone they haven't chosen themselves because they've seen it on the news, or if they're from certain communities, it can be really tough to explain to your friends and family or to your congregation why it is that you've gone and had an abortion. So I think it's been really tough for a lot of women to come out, but I think that we have seen quite a lot more of that. And so my job is advocacy, which essentially means getting as much information we can from women about what they find difficult about the existing law, what's put them in a difficult position, what has made it harder for them to access care, what has meant that they have presented to us later or that they haven't been able to access the kind of abortion that they wanted. And so that kind of advocacy, I think, has been very helpful. It's also part of the work that BPAS has done over many, many years to better interpret the way that the Abortion Act works. So the Abortion Act itself, on paper, I think can be read very conservatively. It could mean that very few abortions were allowed, and it entirely depends on how it's interpreted, how the courts see it, but also how individual doctors see it and how everything is provided. And so a lot of the work that we've done over the years is sort of testing case law, making sure, alongside, for instance, the Royal College of Nursing, who got a ruling in the 1980s from the House of Lords, which is now the Supreme Court, that said that nurses could provide treatment, that it didn't have to be doctors all the time as long as the doctor was overseeing care. We've done court cases on Northern Irish women's access to abortion, which not successful yet, but hey, it's fine. We're intervening in cases around some of the other stuff, including some things on the time limit, some stuff on home use of abortion medication, as I said earlier. So we do quite a lot of legal work to sort of make sure that our doctors and the women that we see are on good legal grounds for the work that we do. It's not ideal though, and I think we've been spending quite a long time recently with the We Trust Women campaign trying to make sure that in future we can decriminalise women and doctors. So we have a couple of bills in Parliament at the moment that are looking to do that, which would mean that women couldn't be criminalised no matter how they accessed abortion, because I think it is a curious Commonwealth situation that's imported a law that has its basis in 1835 to say that actually women should be criminalised. We talk about other countries around the world. In America, they're not criminalised. In Poland, they're not criminalised. In much of South America, they're not criminalised. In Saudi Arabia, they're not criminalised. I mean, that's because women don't have any legal rights, but you know, you get my drift. It's a very unusual situation. And we have the harshest punishment anywhere in the world, life in prison, that's it. Nobody gets killed for having an abortion around the world, life in prison, that's it, and we win, great. So I think that it can be really tough to argue, less so here, but more in England, where any woman thinks that she can get an abortion, sort of no questions asked, which is not the case. But I think that the underpinning law means that our nurses, our doctors, and the women that we see are on not shaky legal ground, but are in a difficult position, doing things that they know are not ideal, such as having to send women away because there are only a set number of doctors So if they want a manual vacuum aspiration, which is an early surgical procedure, which can be performed by nurses and midwives if they're appropriately trained, can't legally be done because of the way the Abortion Act works. If we're talking about doctors who don't go into abortion care because they're scared about the possibility of being sent to jail for 7 years for authorising an abortion that wasn't that is eventually judged not to be okay. You talk about papers like the Daily Mail, actually it was the Daily Telegraph, sorry, going out and saying that actually doctors are okaying abortions for sex-selective abortion, when that wasn't what happened. What happened is they turned up and said, we have a genetic condition that runs in my family that only applies to boys. If it's a boy, I need to have an abortion for this reason because they have a chronic condition, which isn't sex selective. They've been very clear around the world that actually there are reasons that you can have it. I think that there are, I think, quite a few things that mean that the Abortion Act just isn't really the best way to provide this care, and it does set us up for sort of additional hurdles, not to protect women, but in order to satisfy a 50-year-old law. And the guy that passed it originally, Lord David Steele, he actually agrees that now is the time to decriminalise, that the way it was done was very much a product of its time. In 1967, women had to spend a week in hospital for an abortion. The way that it was performed was later on predominantly caesarean section. It was a very, very different procedure. The risks were a lot higher. Women were dying regularly from infection, from backstreet procedures that were being performed on kitchen tables. We're in a very different position when you can buy safe and effective pills online, and which a lot of women do that. And so I think that the idea that we should continue to criminalise women for doing something that, as the owner said, happens around the world regardless of the laws, just is completely inappropriate at this time. However, I suppose I stand up here as someone who works in Great Britain, and just to say that we don't have the best framework. We're campaigning to change the framework, but there are ways to make it work. Just because you have not the ideal framework doesn't mean that your women can't access abortion. It just means that you have to work a bit harder to make sure that the people that are providing it know that there are things they can do to make it as easy as possible. And by easy, I obviously mean that they can access the services to which they are legally entitled. So I think that that essentially is what you need to remember, that even if the command paper goes through as it is, and obviously that's not what I asked for and it's not what you asked for, but if it does, that doesn't in itself mean a failure. I think there are plenty of things that you can do to make sure that the women in Gibraltar are still well served by the law and not that the law serves them. So, thanks.